and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today's the third and final episode in our discussion of Plutarch's How to Distinguish a Flatterer from a Friend. In our first episode, we distinguished what is a flatterer, versus a friend, and we saw that a flatterer is somebody who encourages us to become worse as a human being. A friend is somebody who encourages us to become better. So it's all anchored to the pursuit of truth and justice and virtue, and the idea that by nature, we love what is good and right, but we also have a partiality towards ourselves which can confuse us and bias us in making a judgment. Have I done what's right? Am I doing what's right? So a friend is somebody who can help us to achieve clarity in that, and a flatterer is somebody who, for various reasons of their own, because they're using us for some other purpose, they don't really care if we're doing what's right or good. They're just trying to get something else out of us. That's the basic distinction. In the second episode, we looked at Plutarch's discussion of how exactly do you unmask the flatterer. And the most important lesson that we've seen that he comes to repeatedly is that we need self-knowledge and self-discipline. We need to be able to actually understand ourselves and have our own sense of what is right and wrong and how we relate to that, so that we can see when somebody is manipulating us rather than telling us the truth. But he also goes through a number of specific tricks, things that flatterers will do. And in a nutshell, it's all phony. So that's what we have to look for, is if somebody is telling us things that are not true, they're putting on an act, they're exaggerating things, or that the decisions they're making are not based on what is right and wrong and good and bad, but is based on indifference to that, which means that whatever's going on, it's not really for our benefit. So today, the third and final in this series, we're going to look at the positive side of this. How can we be a good friend? Since friendship is a good thing, we want not only to know who our friends are, but we want to be good friends. And Plutarch will close his essay with a substantive discussion of that question. So we'll begin with Plutarch's summary of what he has said up until this point. If we hearken to the God and recognize the immense importance to everyone of that saying, know thyself, and at the same time carefully observe our nature and the education and training with its thousand shortcomings and respect to good, and the large proportion of vice and vanity mixed up with our words and deeds and feelings, we shall not make ourselves so easy a mark for flatterers. So there's a lot in here. This is summarizing what he's taught us so far, and we see that the central concern here is the God and the good. Basically, what is true and good, and if we're focused on that, that's the key thing. Second is self-knowledge, because we need to know how we relate to this. Do I have the truth? Am I doing what's right, or am I off track? Third, we have the education and training. It takes practice. So we're not going to get there in one day. We're just going to wake up and be virtuous. We have to be working at it constantly. So this is another question to ask ourselves. Am I making progress in virtue, or am I slacking off? And then finally, we have humility. So recognizing that while I may have accomplished some things and done some good, I have fallen short, and I'm continuing to fall short in various ways. And if I'm aware of that, put all this together, then I will be much less vulnerable to flattery. It'll be much easier to detect it as falsehood. So it follows that if friendship is promoting this knowledge of the good and promoting self-knowledge and even humility, that friendship needs to be open to criticism. And he calls this, in this translation, freedom of speech, candor, being honest. Right? So friends need to be honest with each other. But there's a very significant warning here, so let's go through it. Just as in the case of any other medicine, he says, who's going to treat candor or honesty as medicine, which means it's good for you, but it's not necessarily pleasant. To employ freedom of speech unseasonably is only to give needless pain and trouble, and in a manner to do so as to produce vexation, the very thing the flatterer does so as to produce pleasure. So he's going to go on. This, you actually can do more harm than good. For it does people harm, not only to praise them unseasonably, but also to blame them unseasonably, and especially exposes them to the successful attack of flatterers. For like water, they abandon the rugged hills for the soft, grassy valleys. So we go back to the original statement that it's natural for us to have this kind of partiality towards ourselves. It's natural for people to be defensive. It's natural for people to have some kind of favor towards themselves. And if we're too hard on people, too critical, even though it may be truthful and it may be something they need to hear, it could backfire. And it can drive them into the arms of flatterers because they don't like the harshness of the criticism. They're going to go looking for somebody to soothe that with flattery. And this has the opposite of the intended effect. So the first lesson in how to be a good friend is, yes, you need to be honest with your friend, but don't take it too far. Be seasonable. In other words, be prudent about the time, place, and manner. And he's going to go into some details on that. And the first, point he makes about this is that outspokenness ought to be tempered with kindness, and reason ought to be called in to correct its excessive tartness, as we tone down the too powerful glare of a lamp, that people may not, by being troubled and grieved at continual blame and rebuke, fly for refuge to the shade of the flatterer. So temper it. How do you temper it? Well, he says mix in some kindness. So make sure that you are very clear that the criticism comes from kindness. And sure, be reasonable, but don't be too reasonable. That is just unadulterated reason. He talks about it, reason is like a light. And so he compares it to a lamp. Yeah, a lamp is good. It's giving you light. It's much better than being in the darkness and stumbling around. But still, it might get into your eyes, and that's counterproductive. You can't really see clearly if the lamp's shining in your eyes. So it's good to have a lampshade. It's good to have light. It's good to have reason, but it's good to also buffer it with more pleasant emotions, for example, so that the reason just doesn't seem too raw and too harsh, too bright, like a bright light in your eyes. And Plutarch, in making this point, he goes back to a very classic Socratic idea of the golden mean, that virtue can be seen as a mean between extremes. And he points out that we often miss this because people often, instead of banishing vice by virtue, they try to go to the opposite vice. And he gives a number of examples here. Exchanging modesty for impudence and countrified ways for town ribaldry. So if somebody has, for example, a flaw of being too modest, too withdrawn, it doesn't mean that what they need to become is impudent. They need to start going around insulting people. If somebody is fallen too much into the town ribaldry, as he says, somebody's been corrupted by the way the city ways, it doesn't mean that they have to become a country bumpkin as a solution for that. And if somebody has a vice of cowardice or effeminacy, it doesn't mean they have to become audacious and foolhardy. So he goes on in this vein. This is a very important point because if you state it this way, it's pretty obvious, right? You don't solve one problem with another problem. But we often overlook this because we think, oh, I'm too far this direction. I'm just going to swerve as far as I can go in the other direction. And this is what he wants to say about friendship. You don't want to take it to the extreme of being so honest and so reasonable with your friends that it hurts and they don't want to be around you. Another really important lesson here is he distinguishes this freedom of speech from reproach and from basically argumentation. So if it looks like you're defending yourself or you're counterattacking when somebody has criticized you, this is going to fail, even if what you're saying is true. For he says, people do not regard speech on the speaker's own behalf as arising from goodwill, but from anger. and reproach rather than admonition. So admonition is when you are, criticizing somebody for their own good. But if it looks like you're just responding to something they did that offended you, then they're going to think, well, your motive is you're just defending yourself. You have a selfish motive. And this is, again, going to backfire. Not necessarily because it's too harsh, but in this case, because it's a question of motive. So if you flip it around, you want it to be as clear as possible that your motive is for the good of this person and that you're not defending yourself or otherwise trying to accomplish anything other than just their good with your comments. Next, he turns to the question of humor. And I find this one interesting because some really great men have recommended using humor for this very purpose. So St. Thomas More, for example, was famous for using humor to be able to admonish people towards virtue without offending them. And I don't think Plutarch would disagree with that, but I think he's warning us that not to take this too far, not to take it to the point of sarcasm or clownishness. So he warns against insolence, jeering, mocking, and ribaldry, which are the evil seasonings of freedom of speech. So you may think that by lightening things up, it's going to make it easier. But he compares this to a surgeon doing an operation. The surgeon has to be very supple, as he puts it. The surgeon has to be able to make very fine motions and exactly the motions that are necessary. A little bit too much or too little is going to spoil, the surgery. You don't want to see a surgeon that's clowning around and flailing his arms in all directions. That's what's going to happen to you. That's pretty scary. So there's a delicacy, he's saying here, there's a delicacy to this, and you don't want to treat it as just a joke because it's something that is very serious and there's a lot at stake, and you have to show a certain kind of respect for the person ultimately and for what you're saying about them or to them that concerns their welfare and their happiness. The next lesson he has, we may be familiar with the expression, don't kick a man when he's down. And Plutarch stresses this is very important. He says that when people are in prosperity, then they often need to borrow wisdom from others. They may be full of themselves. They may be carried away. And, admonitions may help to keep them lowly when they're puffed up. But when somebody has fallen down, when they're hurt, when things are going badly for them, he says the circumstances themselves are reproving them and bringing about a change in their mind. They don't need somebody to come say, oh, I told you so, or hey, didn't you notice like how badly things have gone for you? That's all your fault, right? They don't need that. They know that. They're already feeling that and thinking that. And he says what people need at this point in time is to look into the eyes of a friendly person, consoling and cheering one up. So later on, we're going to see that he looks at things almost like there's a little, friendship bank that you have. When you do need to criticize somebody, you need to make sure that there's money in that bank, that you have shown that you're a friend to this person, that you have shown that you have their best interests. And this would be one of the most powerful ways to do that is when somebody's in need of help or consolation, you give them the help and the consolation. You don't rub in, what led to that. There's better, times and occasions for freely, criticizing somebody when they need it. Now, here's an interesting one. He says sometimes people are in a situation where other people are criticizing them, and there may be some truth to that criticism. Now, this reproof from other people is making them somewhat humble. It's abating their pride. They're starting to have doubts about themselves. And what he suggests is this. First of all, you should console them and defend them somewhat. You should say, these people are going too far. They're being too harsh. They're being too hard on you. But you could also include the admonition that you do need to be more careful about this, if for no other reason than to shield yourself from these attacks. So it actually could be an opportunity for you to reinforce, but in a gentler, kinder way than their enemies are doing. And in a way that he's obviously suggesting that if in the circumstances they could be receptive to that, if they are actually stopping to ask themselves, is this true or not? You could say, no, it's not as bad as what this person's saying, but there's something that you need to think about here. Another strategy related to this that he mentions is that one way to correct a friend can be to bring up somebody else with a certain fault, maybe similar to theirs, and in discussing that, you're only hinting that this person needs to think about it. You're calling that to their attention in a way that does not directly affront them, but can make them think about what they need to be thinking about, in your opinion. Another lesson here is it says, don't do it publicly, do it privately. Exposing somebody in public, he compares it to a case of a foul disease. We want to make the detection and the exposure private and not advertise it to the world. We also want to lead by example. He, citing Plato, whom, as we know, is his favorite philosopher, he urges old men who want to teach the young reverence to act reverently to them first, themselves. So whatever it is in your friend that you're encouraging them, make sure that you're on top of the same thing and you're giving them, first of all, a good example to follow. Probably the most powerful thing of all, regardless of whether or not you would verbally bring up the issue. And a variation on this. So rather than simply setting a positive example, if you have to correct your friend for something, consider, am I guilty of the same thing? And if so, you can correct yourself along with them. You can basically say, look, we need to work on this. You and I both have a similar kind of issue. And when they see that, basically you're working together on this, that makes it a lot more attractive than if you're telling them, high and mighty, that you need to work on this, when they can probably tell that you do as well. It's not going to come off as being sincere and for their best interests. And we saw before he talked about shading the lamp, and here he comes back to a similar metaphor, and he specifically says mix praise with criticism. This is a way of making it much easier to endure. When you mix the praise and the criticism, it's much more palatable for somebody to take that criticism. And also another way to make criticism, more acceptable to somebody is to point out their former noble deeds, and encourage them, plant a desire in them to imitate their former self. So then you're not saying, okay, you definitively have this flaw, but you're saying, look, you've done great things in this particular area. But you seem to be slipping there. I'd like to encourage you to get back to what you were before. And that's a more encouraging way to encourage them, inspire them to aim higher. And coming back to the idea that you don't want it to seem personal on your part, defensive on your part, never do it as criticism as an actual retort to somebody else. So when they're criticizing or disagreeing with you, is never the time to bring up some complaint you have about them, because that's just going to seem like you are fighting with them, and it's going to become a fight for that reason. Now he distinguishes between small matters and matters of more moment. And he says basically in the small matters, don't sweat the small stuff. Don't criticize people over trivial things. Because again, going back to the money in the bank metaphor, you're just going to be spending that money for unimportant things, and then when you get to something more important, this person's going to be tired by that point of hearing your criticism, and they're going to see you as a scold, everywhere sour and glum, knowing and prying into everything. And he says this is intolerable. It's not even tolerable to children, whom in a certain sense, we have to do this, or we have to do some version of, raising them, educating them. But he says it's insufferable even to slaves who have in the social strata of the time have no right to object, perhaps, but they're human, so they're going to have a hard time putting up with this. In other words, he's pointing back to human nature again. He says people simply, they're human. They have limits to how much they can take. So don't push them too far, and save your ammo for things that matter. And so our closing remark is another emphasis on the need for kindness and praise. For as a clever doctor would prefer to cure the illness of his patient by sleep and diet rather than by castor or scammony. So if you're a good doctor, you're not looking for the most painful treatment. If there is a simple treatment, that's the best one. So a kind friend and good father or teacher delight to use praise rather than blame to correct the character. If you can find a pleasant way to encourage somebody to improve as a human being, that is always the better way to do it. For nothing makes rebuke less painful or more beneficial than to refrain from anger and to inveigh against wrongdoing mildly and kindly. So again, we will have to use criticism in true friendship because it is based on the pursuit of truth and virtue, and we're all flawed. So at some point, we are going to have to call attention to flaws and limitations of the other person. But nothing will make this more successful than if we do it without anger, without selfishness, and without any relish. It has to be clear that we don't relish criticism per se. We're only doing it when and where necessary. And in the context where, going back through what we've read, a context in which we are anxious to help, we're anxious to praise, we're anxious to be pleasant and useful and consoling to people in all the ways that they need it, such that when we do come to a criticism or a disagreement, it is as obvious as possible that it's genuine and sincere and well meant. So that is our discussion of Plutarch and his practical Platonism. So we can see that this is, Platonism because it is rooted in the idea that our lives individually, but also in our relationships with each other, that the goal is truth and justice and virtue. These are the things that bring about happiness and flourishing, and that these things require discipline. They require self-discipline, but by extension in our relationships, they require us to discipline one another in prudent or appropriate ways. We have to challenge one another, in other words, to become better. This is the focus of Socratic philosophy. Happiness comes through virtue or self-perfection, and that is a struggle, and that's something that we have to be individually willing to do and to help each other to do. That's where the common good comes from. But in looking at how to implement this in a practical way, one thing we may notice is a lot of what Plutarch is saying is common sense, reminding us of things that we surely already know, we've already heard many times. But he also has a very keen eye for how and why we forget these things in the moment. What is actually throwing us off track, the emotions and the reactions that we have, which are not following this common sense. So we can see here that Socratic philosophy doesn't have to be something that is highly abstruse and hard to understand and really kind of hard to connect to life. Quite the opposite. It can be very commonsensical observations about how to get the best out of life, how to get the best out of relationships, how to tell who really has your well-being in mind versus somebody who's just using you and manipulating you, for example, is hardly just an academic question. It's something that we all have to be concerned about in our lives constantly. But in explaining this, Plutarch is showing how Socratic philosophy can help us to dig a little deeper into what's happening and why this is happening. But also, he's showing how this philosophy has to be, worked out in a practical kind of way if it's going to really help people. And he dedicates himself to doing that. which I would close by saying this is a very significant kind of leadership. If you consider the influence, we looked at Machiavelli talking about Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus, and how they had this multi-generational kind of dominance through these empires they built. Well, that's one kind of influence that somebody can have in the world, and it's an important one, although the way Machiavelli understands it, of course, would be rejected from a Socratic point of view of reducing human life down to a kind of a meaningless enterprise. But another kind of influence, and one that ironically Machiavelli himself is imitating because he's not building an empire personally. So his influence has to be over readers and people who are going to read him and adopt his state of mind and follow his advice. But Plutarch is an example of this kind of influence, somebody who had a massive influence and still does. But you can identify many, many great people in history. I'll just mention the American founders, for example, who were avid readers of Plutarch and who studied his lives of the great men, but also studied these moral essays like the one that we just went through. And this is, I think, this is the kind of power that Socrates and Plato are actually after. This is what they think is worth pursuing, is the ability to seek wisdom for ourselves and then to share wisdom with other people in a way that they can understand and that they can implement.